I'm really excited because Affaf, someone we've been speaking to for a long time. I'll let him introduce himself, but just really quickly, he heads up engineering at LaunchGood. They're doing a lot of great work. We'll hear more about that. But today, the discussion is really about just how the SDLC is changing really quickly and how can we be a little bit more proactive in how we detect problems. And honestly, like there's so much advice being thrown around on how to deal with AI and things like that. I think the biggest mistake is to sort of assume certainty. I love conversations like this because we actually talk about on the ground kind of issues, what we're seeing, what we're not. So really excited to have Affaf on, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Thanks for having me, guys. I head up engineering at LaunchGood. Previously, I've led the Vault group at HashiCorp as well. One of the interesting things that LaunchGood has been that we've actually been empowering non-engineers to ship as well. So the problem that we've been trying to struggle with is we're shipping a lot. What do we do to kind of manage it? And what was interesting last week was that the change verification feature that Cleric came out with was quite interesting on like how it's actually, you can call it babysitting, but it's like actually watching the release coming out, right? And one of the ones that I was kind of just taking a look at, if I just share my screen here quickly.
Just talk us through what is this LG deploy, Affaf? I'm assuming you've got some channel up there, right? What does it do? How do releases work?
Yeah, so we just have our own release bot that we use to kind of just throw out releases into Slack as it's working through the GitHub action. So it's very much deterministic, going through all the steps of like, okay, build the images, deploy the services, deploy the UI, and that was really about it. But what was interesting, or kind of the gap here, was that what is happening after each of these steps? These are very much like Booleans, right? Like I've done this, now next step, I've done this. If there's no errors, then just move on to the next in the pipeline for the releases, right? So this is one example of a release that's very much, it was a small change for React, one of the hydration bugs that actually one of the non-engineers, someone on the DevOps infrastructure team kind of picked it up and wanted to ship it out. So it was kind of interesting where they got the release ready, shipped it out. And then what was interesting was that no one really need to go to the actual production site and see that, okay, did it change anything? And this was very interesting. Like we enabled this feature, I believe midweek last week, and started to kind of play around with it. And this is a nice example where it's kind of like shepherding what's happened after the release, right? So previously, it kind of stopped for us with like, okay, something is in production or development, wherever the release was going. And now we're just purely relying on our SLOs, we're relying on logs coming through, like more of our telemetry data essentially. But that was being more reactive, right? If something happened, then we would go back and really dive deeper into it. But what was missing was like, okay, we sure that what has shipped out has actually released or not, right? So one of the interesting things is that in engineering, as a senior engineer persona, it really looks into like, okay, I've done my work, I've released it, now I do smoke tests, right? Smoke test the environment, right? Make sure that what I shipped out actually shipped out. And that's a very common feel for anyone that has quote unquote like productive paranoia, just looking at making sure that things are coming out. And what was interesting here was that we didn't need a human per se to do that anymore. And we saw the verification start kicking in of like, okay, the release hasn't come out. Some of our pipelines take quite a bit of time to actually even release, 10, 15 minutes at times, depending on how many services are involved. And in this particular case, like that's a lot of wastage of like someone trying to babysit a pipeline. But in this particular case, it was interesting where it went through, looked at the change that was there, looking to identify the bug and make sure that it's actually seen the decrease of the particular sections that were impacted. So we see some of this come out over here. And then kind of like just keep on repeating itself as well a little bit until it's all the changes have fully hydrated through. So it kept on going through the process. And once it was like, okay, this release is actually serving real traffic now, there's no hydration errors. And what was interesting here was that it was able to identify that previously there was a 25% error rate, now there's none. But at the same time, looking at the noise as well, right? So in a sense of like, okay, this release is out. There's still some errors here. So we have some other issues that are very low, simmering issues that are there, but that's background noise, not necessarily impacted. So being able to distinguish that, what is this particular release responsible for, and being able to monitor that into production. In the past, like this would be more or less an engineer doing it, but increasingly we're seeing more and more of agentic workflows coming, and that can enable engineers to really focus on the actual real problems and not necessarily being like the glorified, like looking up logs and whatnot, right? So that was kind of like one of the interesting things here.
What makes you skeptical or uncomfortable? Because it's a new thing, right? I think it's an age-old question of As engineers, we like to be in control and we like to know exactly what's going on. So as agents are taking on more of these tasks, as an engineer, how does that hit you and what does ideal look like? And feel free to just completely trash what you saw. We're all trying to learn and build the best thing, right?
Yeah, totally. Obviously, this is our early days, but what I would love to kind of see more of is linking some of the other related issues that might be in linear. This might be our setup. We're still kind of configuring what are the right permissive tool calls to be made. I know we've gone back and forth a little bit on like, what about data, right? So a lot of bugs or issues or verification sometimes attributes not just to the actual code that's shipped or changed, but for a lot of these services also along the lines of the actual data that can compound those types of problems. So how do we do that in a safe manner? And LaunchGood specifically, we are within the fintech space, so we have to be very careful with the data that we're obviously exposing to other systems and services. So we just can't nilly-willy just open everything and say, hey, AI, go wild. That would be very irresponsible for us. So for us, it's like we want to trial and make sure that we're working and building that operational comfort and excellence in terms of these new tools and ways of working, right? So I think one of the biggest aspects is that how do we safely introduce data without exposing it to other third-party services? How do we ensure that we're compliant with the governance controls that we already have in place? I think those are all problems that we're trying to figure out and how best to kind of go about it and navigate it. But it's definitely one where we want to explore further, but have to do it in a manner that's safe, essentially, too. So
I think it would be helpful just to take a step back and go back in time a little bit. I think it would be great if you could maybe introduce yourself in terms of your background at HashiCorp before you joined LaunchGood. From our very first conversation, I got the sense, I was like, this guy is AI pilled. He's super in AI, he's constantly learning new stuff. Talk us through that journey. What built up your engineering fundamentals and like what got you interested in this space and what keeps you curious?
yeah, so I mean, what's interesting here, so a little bit about myself, like I've been in the industry for at this point 20 years. I've been at LaunchGood for well over 2 years now. Previously, I was leading HashiCorp Vault, both managed the community edition and the enterprise editions as well. And that was a very interesting space because Vault had a huge footprint and it's software verification, what we typically call QA, and quality of software was such an important aspect of it. It was also very difficult. So I left Hashi at the end of 2024 and the world was just starting to change with ChatGPT 3 coming out, 3.5 the year before that. It was interesting where it's like things are changing. We don't know exactly what's changing, but something feels different. I think for me as an engineer, I've also gone through and making peace with it as well. I think I had this revelation last year around summertime of like, what is my value as an engineer? And honestly, it was like, okay, if I write code, the value could be questioned. But if I'm solving problems and the business problems that are interesting and actually necessary for the world and for different verticals and different areas, then honestly, this is where it's like, you can almost say, and maybe it's premature, but it's almost a golden age of that because now we can really solve on the real problems and not the ones that are about writing code per se. Like code generators have been there for ages now, right? We've had boilerplate code being generated. We have different languages tackling this problem. So these silver bullets have always been there. But what's been interesting is that that's becoming more and more commoditized, right? Where it can become more accessible as well. So my approach with AI is that this is something that is definitely changing the world around us. We don't exactly know where, and this is even last year was like, okay, what am I doing with my life at this point? But even now, looking at it, that if we're solving business problems, that's really going to enable us to move farther much faster as well. And LaunchGood was quite interesting in the space that at face value, it's a crowdfunding platform, commerce, like how difficult can it be? But because of the regulatory and compliance zone that we reside in, it's actually very complex. We have multiple avenues that we need to be protecting the platform against, whether it's regulatory, financial, technical, there's different avenues of it. And AI was one of those things where the entire leadership team and many others that we saw as potential opportunity, but many others as well that, hey, this could be challenging. So it's been more or less about like, how can we pragmatically introduce it? So last year, we slowly introduced different ways, first with incident management, then slowly picked it up with more and more code generation. And this past Ramadan, so Ramadan for us, we essentially see 10 months worth of activity in a single month. So it gets extremely busy very quickly. In this past Ramadan, well over 90% of the code was being committed by AI. One of our company goals for this year is that 100% of the staff will be shipping something to production. And that includes biz dev representatives. We're talking about customer support. And these are not just simple like CSS or HTML copy changes. What we would love to see are actually logical changes, things that have been on that backlog that have been burning a hole into people's minds. Like, why can't we just do this? Well, now you have tools to do that. But in engineering, for my role for it specifically, the other problem is I don't want step ones. I don't want my engineers waking up at 2 a.m. in the morning trying to solve that bug that got shipped accidentally. So I think software verification and the quality controls of that is becoming increasingly important. Everyone's building a coding agent at this point. Like I think that the bar is so low at this point. And we've talked about this in the past that
Yeah, we have.
every other vendor for the past year and a half that we've been working with, everyone has a coding agent now. Whether it makes sense or not, they have a coding agent. Even Linear just recently this year introduced their coding agent as well. So it's all these like are interesting spaces. So the problem is like, okay, everyone's shipping code. You have so many different agents able to do that, but how do you know that you've actually shipped the right thing? And that's both on the principal side, but also on the implementation side as well. And that's a problem that's quite intriguing right now, at least on a personal level.
So, Affaf, where do you currently land in terms of you have this goal, everybody in the company is going to be shipping code, at least some level of logical change, not superficial, but there's kind of stages to getting to that. And I can infer what guardrails you need to put in place. How deep in that journey are you? Because you probably want to have some base parts in place already. For example, maybe some secure sandboxing or places for things to execute, given the surface area is not going to expand to the whole organization. So maybe if you can just give us like a high level of where you are on that journey.
Yeah, we're definitely on the earlier start of our journey, essentially. We just started our fiscal year about 3 months ago at this point, actually. So we're just getting close to wrapping up our first quarter. The approach for us was that let's do crawl, walk, and run. That's the scenario that we've been talking about. And for us, what is very much low-hanging fruit is within like an EPD triad, for example, or trio, right? In that functional group that we've always worked within, let's get the designers and the PMs first shipping code, right? Being able to do that. That's like first because they understand some of the tooling, some of the constraints of the systems, get them going. So we're just transitioning through that phase right now where they're just like add cursor in Slack, for example, that triggers it. The engineers are watching it as well and being like, okay, how do we tweak the context that we're giving the agents? How do we work with creating those dev environments that previously you would actually either have these QA environments that you're maintaining or these sandbox environments, or you're doing it locally, right, with the testing verification. But now how do you do that for individuals that don't have that set up essentially? So a lot of that has been going into setting up those toolings, the right context in place, the guardrails. It's been interesting. I talked to some of my peers across other companies and whatnot, and it's been quite intriguing to talk about that. Hey, all the technical debt that we've been like shoving under the rug for years of the end-to-end testing suites, all of that. Well, guess what? If your leadership wants being fully AI pilled, those are the guardrails that we desperately need now to actually enable AI to perform in a secure manner and in an efficient manner as well. Otherwise, you're just like token maxing or just burning through your budgets at that point because you have no way to ensure quality or maintain that quality control for your organization. So I think for engineering leaders, it's becoming an interesting lever that a lot of the things that we have sometimes kind of pushed aside, we have a new opportunity to bring that back into the conversation, because if you want to go fast, we need to pay off some of that debt that we've been shying away from at times. So
has that changed the allocation of how you put engineers behind problems? Has it gone to 40% of time now spent on paying down tech debt? If it's not 80-20, like what's that number to you?
It's a work in progress. We're definitely trying to get more of that focus in and trying to prioritize our roadmaps to include that work as we kind of work through that. Right now, we essentially established like a AI task force within engineering as well that is really looking at picking up those very integral pieces that are the multipliers for the organization, right? So one of the key things that we did was how do we build these highly scalable QA environments across our pipelines in a manner that is sustainable. We have one legacy code base, one modern microservices-oriented code base. So we have a lot of interesting technical choices over the years that we need to kind of wrangle together and build that through. So for us, it's been going through that journey of, okay, can we get everything going in one area for an agent to work with? Then comes the next piece of improving our end-to-end test suites. So we were sending the right signals back to the user and making sure that they're getting the right signals back from their agent. And then from there, there's a lot of training that goes behind it as well. I think one thing that's interesting is that we've really found the benefit of the multiplayer aspect of agents, essentially. There was that mindset of having an agent that's restricted to a certain channel, for example, or one-to-one DM, whether it's on Slack or in the web space as well. What we find very interesting is the multiplayer impact of agents that do support that. We saw the adoption with AI increase tremendously. So I kind of joke around that it's the art of possible, right? There's many developers with years of experience behind them. They've only done things a certain way. And how do we as leaders now help them understand this new way of doing things? Yeah, you have YouTube videos, you have content coming out, but if you're not actually able to showcase that in real examples, it's a struggle. We saw that with Cleric originally. It was just a few of the individuals doing it, but then as soon as we saw publicly folks doing at Cleric, for example, and even like at Cursor or whatever, whichever agent that we had going at that time, we saw other people looking like, I can do that with that agent. Okay, cool. Now that we would see more of that happening, right? So that multiplayer aspect has been one of the key growth hacks, essentially, in terms of helping people adopt and move faster with that, more than any training sessions, essentially.
I guess it begs the question on what the end goal is, right? Because we started off with this idea that we're trying to get everybody involved to write code that goes to production. Why is that the goal? Before, it used to be, if I'm a designer, I do design work. If I'm a backend engineer, I just stick to backend. And I'm hearing this a lot, right? Like as a product manager, I'm shipping front-end code. I'm unclear. It's like, just because something can be done does not mean it should be done. I'm curious on your take on why that is better.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting proposition for us, right? Within engineering and within, I think, generally any organization in 2026 at this point, is that previously there's been hard constraints, whether it's budgetary, whether it's skill sets of like items in a backlog, they're just sitting there collecting dust. Or you're on a call with the customer, they have this interesting idea, and now you're stuck with like, okay, do I action this by deprioritizing something? Or does this go into the backlog to collect dust now? And with the way that this new tooling is coming around, I think there's an opportunity here where we've seen our experiences as well, where someone has a problem. I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, there was a conversation of like, hey, should we do this experience with a tooltip or a drawer on the mobile, right? Previously, this would be a bunch of UX studies that go through, maybe some user interviews with those design mock-ups and whatnot. I was like, well, let's just throw up 2 PRs. Well, here you go. Which one do you like better, right? Based on experiences, and we had some tweaks and stuff. But I think that's the opportunity that it provides. Now, how does this translate to business value? I think that's an interesting question. And I think we're still working through that as well. For us, I think it's how do we get more capabilities or capacity for our product org, right? So today, we're about 25 or so individuals within our product group, and that's limited by our budget with various different aspects of it. How do we enable the entire organization to not be the builders, right? The concept of a builder is very much coming forefront. And I think that's the part that's interesting, is that, hey, that support person, they get an interesting question or a pain point that keeps happening, like being able to rename your credit cards on our platform. That's a feature that we'll never be able to get very high in a RICE score, for example, if you're going through a traditional prioritization framework. But why can't that CX team member or the customer support member just use AI to help build that small feature out, right? Very small, minimal feature, but has a lot of improvements for the end user as well, potentially. So
yeah, I'm curious. So I think we can probably extrapolate like why features need to exist, right? Every company has many features in the backlog, some of them more dubious than others. But I love the idea of extrapolating where this goes, because a human ability to generate new ideas is almost limitless, but eventually these code bases will crack. Do you see any failings on the other side of this? Like if this continues for another year or 2 years, models get better, they become more agentic. Maybe every person in the company now has 5 to 10 agents running at the same time. Surely there's a limit. And I guess that's tied to the fact that over time, they're currently the bottlenecks in review, right? And we're letting them go. I mean, for like UI changes, often we don't scrutinize every piece of CSS and React change. For core backend changes or migrations, we still do. But I think that's also going to change in a lot of companies, the better these models get. So I don't know how you think about that ad infinity.
I think that's an area that a lot of folks are trying to wrangle with, right? Like there's a lot of benefit with, yes, now we can ship a lot of code, but then how do we validate and verify those changes, I think, are becoming increasingly important. And I think the part that is interesting is that I think many of us just have hypotheses, right? So for me right now is that code reviews, the practice of code reviews, even at a human level, there were some fallacies with that approach as well. Like if the PR is too big or even if it's too small, sometimes folks just glaze over, right? Like it's just human nature. You have a human in the loop, you will always have those types of challenges, right? So we always kind of afforded that type of margin of error. But the problem now is that AI is amplifying that quite a bit. For example, LaunchGood, we haven't been completely oblivious to that either. Like we've had Sev 1s and Sev 2s, so our highest two incidents essentially over the past few months actually, as more and more of the developers are using AI to ship more, where more PRs are coming in, that begs more code reviews, but code reviews are actually getting difficult as well because they're larger sets of changes just because the agent is able to do that. So now the focus has been starting to shift to is that we really want our engineering org to be very metric oriented, essentially. Beyond just the simple availability and SLOs, we want to be looking deeper into things that really tell us how the code is impacting, right? How the changes are impacting as well. To your original question, one of the interesting things I've been talking about is that we want our teams to be owning certain metrics within their business function, essentially. So now the engineers are becoming like, there was a dilemma of, am I a back-end or a front-end engineer? Now it's like, no, you're a product engineer. So it's like, okay, it's table stakes for you to know the language, the syntax. You have AI to be able to do both back-end and front-end. But now we need to essentially have them be thinking about the business impact as well. And now with LaunchGood, for example, specifically as we're looking at non-engineers to be shipping our work, how do we ensure that what they're shipping doesn't impact the integrity of the code base and the quality of the experiences as well? And what we're betting on is that if we have enough telemetry coming from the metric side of it, we're able to create that loop that can be enabled and supported by AI, but also be a signal for the humans, the engineers, that, hey, something is regressing here in this particular area. And that's beyond just the simple things like SLOs, but diving deeper into areas where we're talking about not necessarily like the code churn, for example, but more or less about how we're doing our imports, like the technical design and some of the constraints around it as well. Some of it is very deterministic controls, right? That we didn't lean in too heavily before, but now we are essentially, that will tell us those signals. One of the interesting things with our designers at LaunchGood has been is that leaning in heavily towards the heart metrics, which is a philosophy that came through Google around UX, for example, where we're looking at the amount of tasks being completed, how they're completing, as a way to tell that, okay, is this particular area of the application, is it regressing or not, essentially, and kind of managing that. So for us, it's like, how do we get more of these signals out there and then be able to engage on those signals? Because the lines of code to be reviewed at this point, it's a losing battle at this point. Like there's just so much coming out, we just cannot stay on top of it, right? And we cannot grow our org 10x either to kind of manage that load. But there was always human error to begin with too. So I think this is one of those things we have to kind of balance out, right? And look at the risk essentially. So
this is an interesting area to go into because what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're moving from this notion of judging work by the artifact and moving more into the outcome. In this case, metrics to me is basically like, what did it do, right? Versus what is it? Like, what's the logic? But you said a couple of interesting things that I want to pull out because I think you framed it very much from the sense of like what humans need to consume, because code review is hard. So I want us to be more metrics oriented. So humans are going to consume. But like, I want to flip that around and say, is that the end state, or is it that we want metrics for agents to consume so agents can do a better job? And eventually, does it move more towards we just have these high level metrics like SLOs did back in the day, but the lower level metrics are actually for the agents? How do you think about it?
it's an interesting one. I mean, we're trying to work through this ourselves right now, but I think about the change verification feature that came out last week, for example, right? And there were some very interesting tidbits in there. Like we use Datadog, so we're looking at the RUM events that are coming out. And it's quite interesting that if I imagine as we have more of the non-engineers build, the same type of outcomes or outputs, I should say, are being measured or are kind of surfacing. Now, it'll be very interesting for AI to pick those up and actually spin up and react to them as well. I don't think we've seen that quite yet with Cleric either. Maybe all of our PRs have been just all green. So thumbs up for the team this past week. But what would be interesting is that as we saw, like I mentioned, there was like this simmering noise for that particular change that, hey, these are the ordinary background noise. We're always shipping or emitting those errors. Well, why can't you have an AI agent identify that and execute against that? And probably we can. But I imagine more and more, as we term it as a judgment, I think more and more what we build from a product sense is going to be a lot more important than what happens at the design layer or at the engineering layer or even at the feature layer. It's really looking at the business outcomes and being able to align with those outcomes and understanding that, okay, is this the right thing for us to be investing in at this particular time? Part of this is like within the broader industry as well, is that everyone's been building a coding agent, like I said earlier, right? And working with you guys, for example, for quite some time now, I was also intrigued of like, hey, you're now seeing this bubbling of SRE agents coming in and what that means. So I'm kind of curious on like, as we talk about like change verification, curious on your take on some of this as well on like, what have you folks seen? And there's been a lot of interesting conversations we've had. So I'm kind of curious on what led you towards the change verification aspect. Like before we even get to investigations, it sounds like you're trying to stop it earlier, right? Like, hey, let's not even get there. Let's stop the bleeding much earlier in the process.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think it was a recognition that you want to solve the root cause, but the root cause is not in prod, right? The root cause manifests there, but it's really a torrent of AI generated code coming through the pipeline. And there are many opportunities to catch that earlier. I think people just can't keep up in all of these domains. So if you consider code review, that's an area that's very hot right now. Everyone's throwing their agents at code changes. But post-merge, now you've got people batching their commits together because CI can't keep up with everything rolling out. So even continuous delivery is failing. So during the rollout process, we're also looking very closely at, can we run a more complete test suites or even generate tests for features that are being rolled out that are maybe conditional or contextual based on those changes, to really make sure that this change, especially if it's multiple services that plug together, is safe, or this set of changes. And so all along that pipeline, you're basically tracking changes that could be almost like a hand grenade rolling into prod. Hopefully it's like a cake, right? Making sure that it stays a cake and doesn't explode at some point. Like a Trojan horse now with the Odyssey in rear view. So we're looking at like dynamic check or agentic QA prior to rolling out. Then this verification is another one where we produce telemetry that hopefully we can expand, because it's one thing to look at reliability, but you also want to look at business impact. I think that's something that is on my mind a lot, is how do we know this thing is actually benefiting the business? Because every second it's live in the code base, there's a cognitive load, if not for humans, for agents. And can you somehow remove it eventually if it's not useful? And so we want that loop to be closed. And the loop is going to be closed based on reliability as well as business metrics. And the action you take downstream of that could be healing or fixing it, but it could also be expanding coverage if you've nailed some user flow, maybe you need more of that, or removing it if you haven't. If you can make that loop very safe, then I think you can have everybody contribute. Even that I don't think is enough. Even that, I feel like at scale, you need some verifiers that give you a sense of quality of the system. The structure is strong enough to maintain all this code. Are the seams correct for these agents to make changes safely, or are they just like cutting through the code base every single time and everything is like refactoring very dynamically? So I think there's a lot of techniques that we're going to have to apply that maybe we've shelved for a while that we have to revisit in terms of code health.
That's very interesting, because I think that's one of the challenges that we've been struggling with as well, is that, okay, we have certain guidelines of like this much test coverage that is necessary. And it's easier now to write tests. You can just tell the agent like, hey, cover the paths here, including the not so happy path. But when it comes down to actual experiences, there's still the age-old concept of setting your test cases, then you have your assertions in place. So it's still stuck to that very deterministic, very much like pointed way of flow of checking software, essentially. So what you're talking about as Agentic QA is quite interesting, because let's say you have a brand new feature that was developed or vibe coded or whatever. It goes out there. How do we give it enough context to understand what are the right expectations versus the wrong expectations that could happen, or assertions, I should say. So it'll be quite interesting like how this evolves. I know there's a couple of organizations out there that solely focus on that problem alone, but that's only a subset of the broader picture of like, hey, I shipped this thing. Is it really doing the right thing, or is it causing me harm that I wouldn't even know until like weeks later, for example, right?
And these things only show up at scale, right? I mean, I think the whole vibe coding thing took off because there's just totally different experience with a coding agent in a greenfield project versus a brownfield. Where on brownfield, we've spent decades trying to figure out how to make things safe. I don't think we ever really cracked it. It's still a really hard problem. And somehow that has gotten worse, right? So I think to your question, I see it as a bet on the future that you just can't rest on being reactive. Like you talked about coding agents having way too many, and you also talked about how there's way too many SRE agents. Like there's way too many every agent, right? Like I think really, as much as the model labs are trying to be on the frontier, I think from the agent side of things, both you and us spend a lot of time thinking, what's the future and how do we go there? Because we're still in this moment of flux. We're doing the same thing. And the bet really is that more code's going to go to production. It's going to break in ways that we didn't expect. And how do you build that seatbelt? Like, how do you make it
Well,
easy?
I think this is an interesting one to talk about as well, because I think it's really different for every company, right? It's different depending on what you're shipping. I'm imagining if you're working on Vault, you're not having the marketing person ship code, even if they can. I'm not sure if at LaunchGood it's the same. I'm assuming there's a lot of guardrails in place. There's certain products where you lose trust once, you're basically done for. But there's some companies where if the UI glitches and we can catch it quickly, we can like fix it. It's like low risk. I don't know how you balance those two.
Yeah, I'll first talk to LaunchGood for a moment. There are elements where LaunchGood has helped raise over $1 billion in Canadian currency. We're catching up to our first billion. But in that area as well, if we have issues with our payments or with our payouts, that has a huge trust impact. And the not-for-profit sector is already so prone and brittle when it comes to confidence and trust, essentially. We see a bunch of different issues come up all the time. So even from an engineering perspective, we look at kind of like a cascading level of what are some things that we really need to be extra careful about. So anything around payments, ledgering, payouts, all that, we have to be extra careful. Front end changes per se, or your account settings, for example, right? If you get it wrong once or twice, it's not going to be a major deal. But if it was your payments, then that's a whole other problem. So I do agree with you. I think there is that appetite and that tolerance as well, depending on what you're working on. Vault is a really good one because the footprint that we had was huge. You're talking about targeting anywhere from mainframes all the way to your personal machines, for example, right? That was the footprint that we had to go through. And I remember we looked at some very interesting things like antithesis. They still need to rebrand their name. It's always a pain to...
It's a mouthful.
It is 100%, but it was very much like reminiscence of like the old school chaos engineering, right? Injecting new types of problems into the space to see how these large scale systems that you really wouldn't see the problems until you're like 5,000 or 10,000 pods or 100,000 pods in production. You really wouldn't see the impact until you were at scale. So how do you get ahead of those problems? And I think that tolerance would be different. Different organizations will approach this differently as well. But the bottom line is there still is that skepticism that still exists. One is that AI is still shipping a lot of slop, so I don't trust AI. I trust it, or I can use it and I can leverage it as that cane, so to speak, to kind of support me. But otherwise, I'm not really trusting and letting go of my decisions to it. And I think some folks are still on that journey to go through that. And a lot of it depends on how much they can tolerate that risk and how much they can actually be okay with not leveraging AI for their use cases as well, right? So for certain organizations that are not moving fast or aren't compelled to move fast, whether it's the competitive nature of their space or the high risk domain that they exist in, then those are the challenges that will come in. For example, government, healthcare, all those spaces will be a lot more careful with how they leverage or consume these types of tooling. And kind of going back to earlier, that one of the things that we've been wrangling with is that certain subsets of defects that we see in software is dependent upon the data that cause that defect. So now how do you ensure that you can work with AI in a space where data is highly governed as well? And we haven't cracked that nut, so to speak, either. And it's one that's quite challenging, but I think we will figure out ways to do that. But until then, I think different organizations will have a different appetite, 100%.
Willem, doesn't it equalize though? Like if I'm in an industry like banking, then all my competitors are also kind of stuck in the same speed. So it's fine. And if I'm in consumer, I have to go very fast.
Sometimes there's a bit of luck involved with what you have in place. And this is almost like Fast and the Furious and you're putting nitro in the machine. And the nitro you're putting in today has like sand in it. And if you put too much of it in, the engine's just going to like explode at a certain point. But in the future, in like a year, it's going to be healthy. It'll just like go much faster. And for some teams that have healthy code bases where they can just expand because of the structures they put in place, maybe it's healthy. For others, it could spiral completely out of control. It's almost like we're playing chicken between the competitors. So I think if you're very lucky, you're alone in a space. And if you have competition, you almost have no choice but to try and stay neck and neck with them. And hopefully the system doesn't implode on itself until we get AI that can maintain code bases, that can go completely end to end, that can like garbage collect and all that good stuff. So I think it's a bit scary for some companies. I think if you're doing purely greenfield or if you're starting a completely new company today, I think you're in a very good spot. But yeah, it's a trade-off, right? Because then you also need to establish yourself, etc.
AI is very much an amplifier. And then it kind of goes to your example as well, where if you don't have those proper fundamentals in place and you haven't been taking care of like DevX, for example, within your organization, agents are going to leverage those same types of experiences to kind of implement and execute. So if you don't have those basics in place and instead you have spaghetti code or architecture that is either repeated or convoluted, AI is just going to amplify all that you have already until you get ahead of that, or you kind of get consumed by this burden essentially as well. So that's, I think, one of those challenges, that how do you kind of carve out space to be able to go through the basics as well and be able to kind of implement those changes that will not only ironically help the humans, but also enable AI to move faster and in a more safe manner as well within those spaces.
That's why I liked your point at the beginning of this conversation about how you're using the push to do more AI to do the good, like to do the hygiene work as well. So that sounds like good advice to any engineering leader listening, where a CEO is saying, hey, we got to go faster. And you're also saying, yes, but here's all this other stuff that we got to do. I think it probably came naturally to you that this is the right instinct, but I'm more curious how that conversation goes with business leadership, because it's definitely the case that social media is just full of all these, oh, I did a website in a day, I did X in 1 hour. And you've got one sort of idea of how fast AI is, but then from an engineering standpoint, you're probably thinking, whoa, how does that conversation go with business? And maybe what advice do you have for people listening in to manage the conversation in the best way?
I think this is where it gets a little bit trickier, right? I think as leaders, we have to be able to translate those engineering nuances of like, hey, why do we want to invest in those E2E harnesses now to leverage AI? And I think being able to translate those into business outcomes that, quite frankly, it's just the age-old management of stakeholders, right? Where you need to be able to translate those technical nuances to actual business outcomes. And I feel that AI right now is such a hot topic with leadership right now. Like every C-suite is like, hey, why can't we use more of this AI? Earlier this year, everyone was talking about token leaderboards. And now, halfway through 2026, it's like, no, token maxing is actually a really terrible thing. Don't do that. So we're seeing that shift as well on like, what are the drivers for leadership and how do we evaluate the impact of AI in businesses as well. For engineering leaders or technical leaders, I think that's the tricky part, is that you have to be able to provide for that narration of like, hey, that end-to-end test suite will allow our agents to be able to verify those changes. So if you want work to be shipped out, even when engineers clock out or end their day and it's happening before they join the next day, you need that verification layer. You need to be making sure that what you're shipping out is actually working, right? Or working as you were expecting it to work. How do you do that? Well, you need these types of harnesses to do that. That narrative needs to be driven and be able to articulate in a manner that business stakeholders will be able to understand. Also, the other aspect of it is cost as well. That has gotten expensive over the past few months. We've seen that with the model costs going up. We're seeing that with different types of provisioning or billing models coming up as well. Just today, Hilo announced its changes with its pricing structure. So it's like, yet again, we have to revisit our budgets and figure out next steps on what to do. So it's going to be an interesting time. And it's like, you have to be okay with the flux. As engineering leaders, I think we're going to be targeted at multiple layers. We have the technical layer with like, how do we work with AI to, leverage the best of it and not the worst of it? At the human layer of like, how do I motivate my team that, hey, your jobs are safe, like AI is not going to replace you per se. How do you do that? And then the last piece of it is just the economics of AI. How are you going to be able to leverage AI to provide for that business value and be able to justify the ROI? And when you talk about ROI, it's like, what is the cost of actually leveraging all these tools and how you go about it? And I believe that that's where the optimizations and the learnings will start to kick in, is that not everyone will need to use everything, right? The same advice these days is like, hey, everyone doesn't need to be using Opus 5 or Fable 5. It's like, bring a tank to like a knife fight, essentially, right? As some people like to refer to it. So don't do that. And I think these are the learnings that we're going to continue to have over the next little while. So
how do you have that ROI conversation though? Like something I keep wondering about is what you're talking about is definitely a big thing, that AI budgets are going up. There's companies, I think Ramp just did, Open Router. There's a whole bunch of companies that are raising based on saying we'll save you money on AI. So it's clearly like something CFOs are thinking about. But it's been really hard to draw a clear line between AI spend and revenue, right? Effectively, you got to go to the CFO or the CEO and say, hey, if you put money here, we're going to get this. And now we've just talked about during this conversation that it's really hard to paint that line. So how do you justify that spend?
Yeah, it's probably a $1 million+ question there. The way that I've approached this conversation, even at LaunchGood, is like honesty is the best way to kind of go about it, and recognizing that we're talking about bleeding edge within our space of like how do we build and maintain and manage products, right? All of that is out the window at this point. None of the traditional sense of COGS or any way that we measure costs against the actual deliverables, a lot of those things are being turned upside down right now. And one of those fundamentals is that you need to come up with a function, or at least that's how I've been approaching it, is like a function to like pilot and then extrapolate like, okay, this is the benefit or the ROI that we're able to get. So for example, when we looked at incident management and investigations, we looked at how much time is it saving the engineers from like being able to close down their issues, and the more time we're saving, the more time that they have towards other actually more high value artifacts. So in a more agile sense, they're able to deliver the value more readily so than the vacuum that investigations or incidents typically cause engineering teams to spend on. And that's where it gets interesting on like, okay, can you put the dollar value? Some people use like pure like, hours bill type of situation. Others are able to kind of tie in the knot towards like, hey, okay, if this was an outage in production, this is a loss of revenue. And we were able to get, the incident closed up much faster because now we have that AI supporting us. The classic example is that, okay, at 2 a.m. when we're joining an incident, like something has gone down, some issue has come up, we already have the investigation primarily completed and we have the next steps available. This is one of the things that we've really loved about some of the tooling that we've used, including Cleric, is that now engineers are coming in, reviewing everything, and now just actually actioning on it right away. So we're reducing that time, and actually the ROI is helping to increase that, because during that outage, we would have had X amount of loss in business. So now we're able to kind of trim that down based on how quickly we're able to respond. That's just one example of it. Shipping features is just, one of the more challenging ones, where I think it's more about how quickly you can run your experiments to understand where you can get business value and how do you want to invest in a feature. If you had a bunch of hypotheses, well, with AI, you're actually able to run a bunch of those experiments collectively, which previously would have been more about a sequence approach. So what the learning would have been over 3 to 6 months, now you're able to get 1 month in with that, and amplify whatever you want to do, right? So it's a bit of a springboard that's available for product teams at this point. So
Yeah, there's a notion of being able to punch way above your weight, right? If you're set up
100%.
for it, right? So, like even for us, right? Like we're a small team, but I think the amount we've been shipping and the way we've been able to move would not have been possible for AI, and that's hard to quantify. I want to focus a little bit on what you said on being at the frontier. Like it's a breakthrough kind of technology, and that's kind of the narrative. Man, like I think X and LinkedIn is probably a lot worse, but it's just full of all these hot takes on where things are going. Oh, it's, one day it's software factory, then software factory doesn't make sense, and it's this and it's that. What's your no BS view of what are you skeptical about? What do you think is actually going to happen, let's say 6 months from now? Where's the puck going in your view? And I'll be happy to share our takes as well.
You're saying 6 months. I struggle with it in 3 months now, and I've seen that since last fall, essentially, right? Like everything kind of turned upside down. We're already seeing that the pressure of the finances, the economics of AI are really going to kick in, and they're already starting to kind of creep into conversations. And there's a lot more nuance to like how quickly people are able to jump into new tooling, explore things. I think that is going to be very much real. Verification is going to be the problem. Now we have all of this coming out. We need to be able to understand how do we validate and verify software, right? The true sense of quality, how do we maintain that? And that's going to be a multi-layer or multifaceted. So both at the product layer, at the engineering quality layer, and honestly, I mean, you guys have probably seen this as well. Defining engineering quality has always been challenging to begin with. Do you go qualitative, do you go quantitative metrics? It's a space in its own, and now we're kind of forced with that, with a real impact to how do we do our craft, essentially. So all of that is going to come to a head. So a couple of hot takes here is that frontier models are not going to be the be all or the like we have to be using it. Open weighted models are going to be a real consideration for many teams to kind of start leveraging and almost be forced into that conversation, even if they're not comfortable or ready for it, just because of the economics coming in. And the quality aspect is going to really take front hold. And it's going to be a little bit different than the ones that we saw last year, for example, where it was like Replit or someone where someone dropped their vibe coded apps like database, for example, right? So I think we're going to see a lot more nuanced take on what is quality and what are we really afraid of with AI committed code, right? We saw this a little bit with AWS earlier this year as well. And I think a lot of just your average organizations are really going to start thinking about and seeing that these types of problems are really going to hit home as more and more of the adoption comes in, essentially. And my horizon for these things is like 3 months at this point. Like I did the 6 month, 1 year thing last year. I had this whole plan of like every 3 months we're going to review AI tools, our AI budgets. Didn't fly. So we're down to like quarterly and sometimes even monthly in some areas of our adoption. So.
Willem, any hot takes from you?
I still really think that code should be a single player activity. I think a lot of teams will silo engineers, kind of like in Conway's Law manner, at the very least on components, maybe even repos, versus having them like run their agents over each other's toes and then get stuck, because that's how you go from like 5x back to 1.1x. So I think companies that do that correctly will have a massive multiplier, and the ones that just deny the reality will continue to have this collaboration that slows everyone down. But I think there's going to be many of these examples of ways in which we have to grapple with this technology and figure out ways to maximally benefit it. And unfortunately, there's no time to slow down, right? It's just, there's no chill. Yeah, otherwise your competition just laps you.
I was looking at building out one of those, like, did this typical thing of like, hey, let me rebuild this entire SaaS application using AI and see what the cost savings are. 1 month later, I still have to review those 30 PRs that are out there. So those are the real impacts of it. Yeah, it generated all the code, but was it the right code? I still got to review it. So.
Yeah, it's not free.
Nope.
I think it's a good note to end it on.
Yeah, this has been great. I think just on my take a little bit was I'm really interested in the ROI side of this discussion, because all of the stuff that we've been talking about, like should we use open source models, should we use Fable or Opus or token maxing, that's all optimizing for the eye, right? It's a cost. It's like, okay, how do we make this cheaper? But I'd say that if there's something that is going to make you 10x more revenue, who cares if you're going to use Fable all day for that? But we're just not able to do that. So that's why I'm so interested in this verification side of things. Like right now, it's like early days. We're looking at engineering metrics, looking at logs and errors. Eventually, we're going to go to product metrics. But I think the gold standard is really linking it to business metrics so that we can actually tell you, hey, like this change actually impacted something. It's like science fiction right now. It's a long path to get there. But I think the more you can close this gap, then I think some really interesting discussions can happen. Affaf, pleasure as always, sir. Good to have you. And yeah, until next time.
Pleasure. Thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it.